Very happy to welcome Ellie Norman. She's the Chief Marketing Officer at Formula E. Ellie, welcome to the podcast.
Sean, thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
I appreciate it very much. I always try to dive into people's sports business, origin story, and how they got into the world of sport. What about yourself? How did you find yourself? What was your first gig in the world of sport?
I think in truth,
we're allowed to go a long way back.
I was going to say, I think in truth, the obvious one would be to say 2017 working for Formula One. In truth, I would go way back to when I worked for Honda. So I worked on the automotive side of the business, but I worked for Honda between 2005 and 2012. And for those of you that have been a fan of Formula One for a long time, Honda had a Formula One team back then. So that would be my first foray into sports, which was working with Jenson Button when he was driving and Rubens Barrichello.
And so you were. I was looking over your back catalogue, if I will, or your career, and you were in that role, and then you went to Virgin Media, and that was where you sort of really, I guess, stretched that marketing and advertising and sponsorship muscle.
100%. Yeah. Having moved from automotive, moved into completely new sector. So media, entertainment, telco, bought sponsorship. So that definitely gave me some great schooling in terms of what do clients look for when buying sponsorship. So I did that and also did the advertising for Virgin Media. And that was my last corporate gig before switching into the world of sport.
But again, it would have been a really good grounding in that space if it was still relatively early digital. Advertising was changing so much. Sponsorship was moving from logos on things and on things that move or things that are static to what does digital look like. So I guess having that coming from the telco and Virgin Media being a big business, you would have got a lot of insight from the rights holder point of view.
It was absolutely, I think my sort of foundation of having worked agency side for 5 years, 7 years in sort of automotive, and then the 5 years in sort of media and entertainment gave me just a fantastic kind of basis to understand number one, the theory of marketing and driving kind of growth and value for an organization. And two, 17 years experience of actually getting in and doing it. So really sort of thinking about what the cost per acquisition is, what the return on your sort of advertising investment is, how do all of your sort of channels work together, and then into the effectiveness of sort of sponsorship. So I would say at that time, Virgin Media in the UK had a healthy marketing budget, and the sponsorship was there very much, not from a sort of logo visibility point of view. There was kind of television advertising, out of home, that was really driving that sort of share of voice in the market. And therefore, the sponsorship was very much around the sort of passion points of where Virgin Media's subscriber base and sort of audience was. So it was much more focused around how do you build value for your customers through the various kind of sponsorship properties. And that was everything from the festival, so a big music festival in the UK, BAFTA, so sort of TV, EGX for gaming, and the sort of Commonwealth Games for sports as well.
Was there I was talking to a friend who was in the D2C space and, chasing everything down the rabbit hole and acquisition and, you can run an ad and see the result. And then the shift when he went to sponsorship, which is broad and big and harder to track. But once he sort of understood it, he went, oh, that's he called it the ceiling raiser. Like he had to do it to be able to make everything work. Was that sort of your findings in playing in that space? Because telco is like churn and just acquire a new customer and how can I do it quickly? But making those big bets on sponsorships as festivals or sport, make that change?
It's the way that I think about it is very much everything that you do as a CMO is about driving growth, and that is through how are you building a brand and how is that brand delivering the growth and revenue for the organization. The only thing that changes is your time horizon. And so actually which channels available to you do the short-term time horizon, the medium and the long. And I think a key thing is if you think about something like sponsorship, it is typically on your medium to your long-term time horizon. And therefore, depending on who your stakeholders are, it's just imperative to be very, very clear up front and for everyone to sign up to this is how we're going to judge success and what we're expecting for this. And I think if you miss that step, quite often that's where sponsorship becomes very challenging because those expectations haven't been aligned, and some people might want to see the immediate results, which sponsorship is never going to be able to deliver, like, I know, programmatic digital. But if you're clear on this is why we're doing it and this is how we'll measure that success, then I think sponsorship is incredibly sort of powerful because there is a real versatility as to what you can do with sponsorship, but it is something that should be thought of certainly around a sort of 3-5 year plus time horizon.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the key to a good sales person from a sponsorship point of view, that's setting those bars, because we've all been in that situation where the sponsorship gets sold and then they want that short-term hit, that sugar hit, they want that instant gain. It's like, this is not the right product for that.
No.
And so it is that medium and long-term piece is really important.
Yeah. And, again, when you are, say, a sort of CMO in a organization and you're considering what sponsorship you're going to enter into and actually how you sort of really structure in building that. As a CMO, it's ensuring you've then got enough happening in each of those timeline horizons so that you can still deliver and demonstrate value back to the organization. Whereas if you're going to put everything into sponsorship, actually that can then be very, very challenging to try to sort of manage if you haven't got that sort of immediacy of what channels are you working with that inevitably is doing that sort of conversion of those 5% of people that are in market at any one time, whereas actually 95% aren't in market at the exact same time. So you have to be sort of really priming and building this audience. And that's where I think sponsorship can do an amazing job. And equally, I think sponsorship does a fantastic job at really being able to create something that neither one of you could create together and deliver that value for sort of existing fans, in my case as a sport, but also the customers and the stakeholders for the brand that is sponsoring you.
So we're just talking about your role there and in that advertising sponsorship role at Virgin, and then you did move back into motorsport, into a role at F1.
Yep.
Just take us back to like going into that role and I guess moving, going from brand side and back into a sport. Yeah, take us back to what that was like in 2017 we're talking about.
2017, gosh, it's almost 10 years ago. So that was April 2017. Very fortunate to get a telephone call to go and join sort of Formula One. It was just at the time where Liberty Media had acquired Formula One from Bernie. I always say Bernie had built the most incredible sport and a real visionary, incredible foresight to sort of create Formula One into what it was. In 2017, when Liberty Media acquired it, it was very much with a view of it feels as if this has far more growth potential than has been sort of realised to date. And so I got that sort of telephone call having had a combination of, I think, automotive and this media entertainment sort of experience. And that was, can you come in, set up marketing, communications and sort of content for the sport? So that was an incredible sort of 5 years in sort of Formula One. And I absolutely loved the sort of transformational role I was able to do and to kind of contribute alongside Chase and Sean and the rest of the kind of C-suite. And that was sort of everything from being very clear in terms of what's the vision for Formula One. How can we transform the sport and essentially make it culturally relevant? And there were enough indicators to show us that it had really lost that cultural relevancy in 2017 and had actually been in a sort of period of decline. So being very, very clear around that then really enabled us as a sort of exec team to just run very, very quickly in terms of how do we go about sort of transforming sort of Formula One. And that was everything from opening up social media and encouraging the drivers to be on their socials, through to rebranding the sport, running sort of esports, removing the grid girls, clearly sort of being part of Drive to Survive, but even going into fashion collaborations and, being in music albums or, in Coachella and stuff. So it was just take Formula One out.
I mean, transformation's always hard. Was obviously, obviously you have the catalyst of Liberty Media coming in and a new direction. So it was sort of this is the way that we're going, but you still would have had like traditionalists or, the people that have been there. This is not, this is how we always done it. And how was, I guess, pushing through some of those changes? Like, it's always good in hindsight to say, here's all the box we tick, but there would have been some tension and to bring in that change.
100%. And I think one of my observations is, as much as I like change, for a lot of people, change is not a good thing. And I always think about change takes you into an area of discomfort, and that's where you grow the most. But in truth, change is not something that humans naturally gravitate towards or enjoy. So can be incredibly painful. And I think some of my reflections on driving that change, because there was an awful lot of sort of tension in the system, as you would imagine. And, you are working with very, very smart people. But if you think about many of the people in the sport, they'd been in the sport for a very, very long time and had, on the most part, come much more from a discipline or a space of engineering. So real precision, being able to almost kind of know the outcomes in terms of what was being sort of implemented. And actually what we were suggesting had a lot of looking into the future, understanding a data set of where we were and therefore we needed to change. But there is a lot of trust that needs to be placed in imagining what the future can be. And to really sort of take people on that journey involved a lot of work to ensure that people felt like they were part of the change and contributing. And what was really important as well from a fan perspective was to really understand, what does the avid and the engaged Formula One fan want, or the more traditional fan want? And, certainly at that time, it was access to data, really starting to see behind the scenes of what was happening. And actually one of the sort of initial launches that was made was a product called F1 TV. And that very much came from the place of listening to what our loyal fans wanted and giving them more of that. So the product is now very, very good, sort of coming up for 8 years old, but just starting with a place of bringing to life the data that the teams would see in the sort of garages, or the sort of engineers would have, the strategists would have, make that available to fans in the form of an app, and actually in markets where it was permitted, actually create a live streaming product. So you could kind of watch the race, but you could also select a number of different kind of live onboards from each of the sort of cars, or a garage view, as well as the sort of international feed. And so now when I think about sort of driving transformation and change, I think for me, the key steps are doing that listening exercise, really sort of learning, being able to then distill and to simplify, set a clear vision, create the followership, and then sort of just execute that with passion. But that key step of that listen, that learn, that simplify and distill is very much ensuring you're taking people on the journey and they feel part of that with you, and remembering to serve your existing fan and how can you serve them better, whilst also then saying, well, what comes next in terms of that association, and how do we grow into and stretch into sort of audiences that typically sit outside that echo chamber of where you're coming from.
Yeah, that first case study is look after your main fans and give them what they want and take them on the journey, and here's what we're doing. But then the next bit you're alluding to, which is you're obviously asked about a lot, is that fan growth piece and how do you reach new fans, which there's a lot of myself as a Drive to Survive, viewer, how do you, how does that type of series come about, but then also leveraging the success of that and really putting the foot down, if I'm using a motorsport analogy, when you do see some of that success with new fans?
Yeah. The sort of insight, and again, this came from that sort of first stage of ensuring that we're sort of listening and learning. But the first thing sort of I did on joining was a really big piece of research, which was essentially ethnographic and semiotics research with an agency at the time called Flamingo. And this is in partnership with Wyden and Kennedy. And if I was to summarize sort of the 12 weeks of research, what came back was F1 felt boring. It felt very clinical, felt overly sort of engineered. You're watching cars like they're driving around the M25, but actually you don't really know anything about the people. And Formula One is a sport where you've had incredible personalities and sort of rivalries in the sport. So, if I think back, certainly, your Sennas and your kind of Prosts, your sort of Nicky Lauda, incredible sort of people, Jackie Stewart and sort of Damon Hill, Nigel Mansell, right the way through. You had Lewis and you had Seb, but no one really knew anything about them. And so actually that sort of first, from this insight, the first thing was, how do we just make Formula One much more human? And that was then everything from opening up the social media, encouraging drivers to sort of be on social media, to start to talk about things outside of what you were seeing kind of play out on track. Because if we can start to build a emotional connection, that human storytelling, that emotional connection, that's where you start to apply meaning. And that meaning then makes watching the cars very, very different if you've got these kind of backstories. And so that started to happen with the socials. And at that same time, there were many sort of streaming platforms, production companies, different organizations that were starting to see the change in Formula One. And there were a few proposals, well, always a lot of proposals that were sent in. And up until that time, it always been sort of a no thank you. But then with the sort of change with Liberty Media, those proposals started to be sort of reviewed. And so Sean Bratches, Ian Holmes is still at sort of Formula One now. Myself and sort of Frank were looking at these kind of proposals, and actually there was a super proposal from Netflix. So we had some other proposals, but the kind of decision to go with Netflix was North America had never really been cracked by Formula One, despite sort of racing in the sort of US in previous kind of decades. And certainly at the time, 2017, Netflix was, and arguably still is, the number one streaming platform. And certainly from my perspective then, was the number one storyteller, long-form storyteller. Very different at the time for Formula One, but there was not a big kind of rights check on the table, but there was some incredible storytellers with a platform of 300 million sort of subscribers. And therefore it was a case of let's go with kind of Netflix and work with the production company box to box to start to tell the story of Formula One, but a story that very few people knew. So opening up the sport, getting inside the paddock and starting to surface these stories. Now, again, a lot of reservation. And in season 1, Ferrari and Mercedes declined to participate. But Ian Holmes did an amazing job of getting the sort of other 8 teams to sort of agree to it. And then in season 2...
And was that a lot of pitching to them and building trust and saying, this is what we're
100%.
trying to build, and selling that future piece of, this is where we think it could be, this is what their audience is.
Yeah. And, Ian did a great job on that. But yeah, absolutely sort of agree that it was everything that had to do. And then just starting to see these green shoots and these kind of signals start to sort of come back to the point where they then sort of agreed. Now, as you would expect, a lot of nervousness, hesitation, not wanting to sort of do it, and just having a couple of things in place so that the teams could review the footage of where they would be before it kind of went live, and that they could ask for things to be amended if it was proprietary, confidential sort of information, or it was defamatory. I think in hindsight, what we did, which was kind of great, was there was only about 4 people inside of Formula One that ever saw the episode finished before it went live. And one of the key things from my perspective was that we would not have editorial rights, as in it shouldn't be us as Formula One determining what that storyline should be, and that if we're going to do something with Netflix, we need to place our trust in the fact that they are the best long-form storytellers. Now, if we take that on as a sports league, we're going to take down the highs and we're going to kind of bring up the lows, and actually we'll be in this kind of space of vanilla and average. And if you think back to any incredible film franchises, series, you've got heroes, you've got anti-heroes or villains, and you've got a story arc, and that's what was kind of needed. So it's wonderful to sit here, and I think I know 8 seasons in and be like, oh my goodness, it's amazing. For me, brilliant that a number of people inside Formula One sort of had this foresight, and this is what we're going to go after, and really sort of created a culture and an environment that allowed us as the exec team to kind of just run after and do all these things.
Well, I want
Secondly,
to say, I'm sorry, I want to say thank you, because I've been using Drive to Survive as a case study on stage for reaching new fans, and then embracing those new fans. I've heard Stefano Demicali talk about completely new audiences. Travis Old talking about the rise of more women coming to the track as a result, because they've learnt more about the sport, but then they also started following the athletes. Daniel Ricciardo becoming, everyone finding out what he's like, what his character is, his personality just shone through that. And that they're the kind of things where you can't plan for as a market you would love, but like having some of those, drivers lean in, team principals like Gunther Steiner and stuff becoming larger than life characters.
Yeah.
When did you start, like, you sort of had those green shoots of seeing that early season, but when did you start seeing that data move of like, oh wow, our whole demographics are changing, we've got a whole new segment coming through?
Yeah. I mean, those green shoots, as you will kind of know, you don't sort of get data out of Netflix. But certainly the green shoots that we started to see was people starting to talk to you about Formula One or reference Drive to Survive that were just not this sort of audience. Starting to see the engagement on social media. Who was commenting on sort of posts. How much was being shared. So this sense of almost a community starting to sort of build. And, for I would describe them as like the midfield teams at the time, actually just really starting to see the appeal of those teams. And to your point, these kind of characters that might never have kind of come through, that then really started to sort of change. And Drive to Survive did so much. But I think it was part of this layering that we were just working for. Like, there's never going to be one silver bullet.
Yeah.
Drive to Survive, big contributor. COVID, I actually think, was helpful to Formula One. First sport globally to come back, wasn't reliant on grandstand crowd noise. Esports was running whilst COVID was there, so you saw the drivers. We were still doing races, but we were doing them online. Broadcasters like Sky and ESPN investing significantly into commentators, bringing other sports stars in so we could generate kind of content and sort of across sort of champion to champion, athlete to athlete. And this, for me, this kind of constant sort of layered effect, as well as starting to do these sort of brand partnerships with the likes of BAPE or Antisocial Social Club, started to just change the sort of dynamic of apparel and merchandise wanting to get sort of in on the sport, right the way through to sort of working with Daniel Caesar, a musician, and doing sort of album shoots at sort of races, or kind of getting jungle into the sport and then going out to Coachella. So this just started to change over time the dynamics of how Formula One was showing up.
And that was the case, that you just had to keep pushing into those different areas because you sort of dealt with that uncomfortableness to going, well, actually, if we are at a music festival or we are turning up at another sports event, or, you know, we have got drivers walking down a catwalk at a fashion festival, that's what Formula One is. And it sort of started to get really that pop culture cut through.
Yeah, that pop culture sort of cut through was certainly something that I felt was important to build since I sort of joined. And my sort of mantra was always, you have this incredible sport, like motorsport is just amazing, but it needs to be taken outside of the sort of echo chamber of motorsport. And so in some respects, it's very different to other sports. Grassroots is really hard. It's very expensive. It's not like, you know, we can go to the supermarket and you can buy a football, or you're playing football or kind of netball or rugby or sort of cricket at school. You don't do motorsport, you know, as you're coming up through this sort of ages. And so really important to find ways to take motorsport out and to find where that emotional connection can be, because irrespective of whatever sport you're in, fundamentally, it is about belonging, community, and connection.
And definitely, I mean, in your time, but like if you look at races, you know, whether it be down the road from me at Albert Park, or, you know, at Monaco or Singapore, like just the race day and the whole precinct has changed in, you know, since Liberty Media's come on board. Obviously, they brought in Las Vegas, which is the, you know, the very far end of one end of it. But like, it is more like a music festival now. It is, you know, you'll see a big concert, or you'll be having you'll have pop-up restaurants from different places. It's, yes, you are still going to go there and you still want to see quality and you still want to watch the race, but it is that total entertainment experience. So someone can go and say, oh, I'm a Carlos fan, but I also want to check out that the hottest burger, and I've got to see a music act. And that's what F1 is now.
Yeah. And it's, I think, particularly post-COVID, and now for Gen Z, and even, you know, to a certain extent, the millennial demographic, they have grown up being entirely digital native. And I think what we're really seeing is how much value exists now in live events. And, you know, now as I look at sort of Formula E and where our opportunity is, what's fascinating with the fan that is attracted to Formula E is sport is just part of their broader entertainment diet and their entertainment mix. And therefore, it isn't about kind of defined verticals. It is about how can we really blend everything that they are passionate about and create an inclusive and an accessible kind of event where you have the competitive thrill of an elite sport, but that sits just as comfortably alongside music, gaming, technology, design, and everything is kind of thought through.
Well, that's the thing. I wanted to talk about your current role at Formula E, and you've had an amazing career. We're going to actually skip over your time at Manchester United. That's how amazing your career has been. But like talking about Formula E, and I've had Mark Preston on the podcast talking about Formula E. How is that? How is that different from Formula One? I think the sustainability piece is a big part of it. But how do you explain it to people? Say, hey, you're at Formula One, now you're at Formula E.
Yeah, it's brilliant. So there is a level of similarity. So if someone is completely sort of unaware, the easiest thing to say is these are the similarities. World Championship racing globally around the world. 10 teams, 20 drivers, very fast, competitive racing. It just so happens the cars accelerate 30% faster than a Formula One car. But actually, for us, the difference is we aren't the electric version of anything, but we are the evolution of motorsport. So this is where the future will sit. And this is a product that is all about being a progressive challenger. So it's recognizing and seeing where the value of sporting integrity is, but we're not afraid to really sort of innovate and to look at how can we evolve this product to better serve fans for today. And the reason we have so many sort of OEMs or manufacturers in the sport is it is the race series where that race to road technology has the kind of smallest gap. So from a cost perspective, the cost cap in Formula One, I think, is $250 million in 2026. And the cost cap in Formula E is $15 million. So in terms of that sort of value that manufacturers can have from competing in a league which has the most overtakes and is the most competitive, that's brilliant value for them. For our fans, they do want that wheel-to-wheel racing action. And again, that sort of accessibility and that inclusivity of typically we are racing in urban environments, so very easy to get there. The access is there because it's a more affordable price point for the majority of people. And our reason to be is just how can we use racing, that sort of live laboratory, to really show how thrilling progress can be when you're never settling and you're constantly sort of innovating and driving forward what sort of technology and innovation can do.
I mean, that race to road is really important. We're in the middle of a massive fuel crisis right at the moment, and we actually do need these things solved. So, and speaking to Mark, that was one of the, we're now looking at fans and what their values are, and what they want, and the new age fan or the younger fan, sustainability is a big part of what they want in their lives, and that's a big part of the innovation matrix you've got at Formula E in like squeezing. It's mainly the cost cap, but like they're trying to squeeze everything out of what they can get, and the performance is part of that.
Yeah. And you're right. The sort of audience, first and foremost, they want to be entertained. So there is no shortage of things that we can choose to do as human beings to fulfill our time. So there is no given that we are going to get people's attention. But actually, by providing entertainment first and foremost, that people want to give us their attention because it is an elite world championship sport is the absolute kind of paramount. Underneath that, it is 100% underpinned because we are purposeful and we are doing that in the most sustainable way possible. And that's where the innovation, the kind of progress really comes to the forefront. Whereas if you think back to when Formula One was created, 1950, so 76 years ago, the combustion engine was absolutely sort of pioneering when it was sort of first introduced. But that technology hasn't really sort of changed for circa 120 years. So a Formula One engine is now most probably the most efficient that you will get from an internal combustion engine. And let's say in Formula One, that efficiency is around about sort of, 57%. A road car will most probably be about 36%. Electric, you're at 97% efficiency. And that's actually why it's quiet. Because sound is generated through inefficiency of an engine. So you're right, there's a lot where there's some similarity, but sort of underneath, that's where the real sort of differences exist. And that was very much the story on a napkin from Alejandro Agag was very much there, that kind of big, bold bet of we can create an exhilarating racing championship, but to do this in a purposeful and sustainable way. And at the time, it amazes me. I think at the time there were only 340,000 electric cars sold in 2014. Today, you are up to 20, 30 million a year. So I think 20% of all cars now sold across EMEA are electric. 50% in China is electric.
I wanted to touch on doing some LinkedIn stalking, and I saw a post of yours a couple of weeks ago because you're still in the business of getting fans to watch. And it's
Yes.
obviously, it's always just like, how do we get more eyeballs? That's the challenge of everyone who's a sports marketer. But you were more talking about how do you get the fans to experience the sport? How do you provide, and again, you're coming from a sport that is data rich, and, we've got all this new technology now that can present data in different ways. That must be exciting for you, and you're able to do things to present the stories in different ways, merge the data of your sport, but also merge it with the storytelling elements.
Yeah, I think if you can bring together data and storytelling, it's just incredibly kind of rich and compelling. And I think I love having partners in Formula E, like a Google Cloud and a sort of Infosys, because you just have incredibly smart people to work with. We have access as the league to all of the data across the cars and from the sort of drivers, and actually being able to take that and to translate and to visualize that into what stories are we telling, and actually how can we help our fans. It's as much how can we help use this data to bring new fans in, number one, but two, when fans start to come in, how can we use that data and that storytelling to actually drive team selection, driver selection, deeper understanding of the sport, and then how do they become advocates of the sport and help grow the community and bring other people in to watch it.
I mean, absolutely. Like things like AI generated commentary and tracking that you can dive into. So if you're a data geek, you can get all the way in, and then that provides you that depth that you once you pique the interest, that's the first job, but you've got to sort of move them down the funnel a little bit. And for all digital natives, that's what they want. They want more accounts to follow, or they want to be able to consume the data they want. And so, that's where I think there is a lot of opportunity for a lot of sports marketers to say, how can you use the data you've got to produce stuff for your fans? It doesn't have to be mass. It can be very niche and be very successful being very niche. So for Formula E, what excites you going forward for the sport?
I'm incredibly excited. We have a new race car that'll be launched, go racing in December. In fact, we have a launch event coming up in Paul Ricard next week. Phenomenally excited about that. This is a huge step change. So 70% more powerful than the existing car today. So that for me is a massive step change. I'm excited and energized by the growth that we're seeing across TV viewership and sort of fans. And actually just the opportunity. There is so much opportunity being a 12-year-old sport where we can co-create and sort of make things with our partners to better serve our fans. The hardest thing is how do we prioritize what we do first?
So that's always normally one of my questions. There is so many choices these days, there's constant developments happening in the AI space, new tech being thrown. You've obviously got new cars and new ways of. How do you prioritize what you need to do as So
as an exec team, we have a number of kind of metrics, and that's everything you would expect from TV audience and growth, EBITDA, how many races are we having? And there is no single kind of answer, but when we are matrixing sort of these ideas, we'll always kind of look at them across those axes really of, is this going to contribute to growing fandom with a commercial partner? Are our values aligned? And what can we kind of co-create that helps solve a problem for the sponsor as well as actually help Formula E solve a problem or create additional value for sort of fans, as well as actually how is this going to sort of contribute towards driving revenue growth for the sport? It's never an easy word sort of conversation, but I think that clarity around the core kind of metrics that we look at, and then you've always got the sort of feasibility of how easy is this to implement. Versus effort and sort of cost.
I mean, it is one of the things we do in Digital to Dollars is helping internal teams, pitch and understand that it's going to have a commercial outcome. What do you look for when someone in your in your team is pitching you something, if they're saying, "Hey, Ellie, I want to do this new series, I want to try this new tech, or I think this is the thing we need to do." What are some of the things that you push back on, or the answers you want in that pitch?
So for me, it always starts with I really want to kind of probe the critical thinking up front. And that is, let's be super clear on the objectives. Who are we talking to? What do we want to achieve? And over what time horizon are we looking? Is this short? Is this mid? Is this long? And having that critical thinking and that kind of rigor that all of these things have been worked out, then into sort of here's an executional plan is what I'll kind of typically look for. And then I think there are things that you can do to help encourage innovation. So we've always got a budget and we've got a sort of finite amount of resource. What's that 70%? We are doing that we know works, and we're going to do that incredibly well. What's the 20% where we can start to kind of run some tests around things that we know works to sort of further optimize that? And then where is that 10% where we've got a hypothesis, we want to experiment, and let's go and see what this could do for us.
Terrific. And I mean, on that, this is one off the top of my dome. If you've got 70, are you looking at things like automation and things that you can say, well, we know the processes for that. Can we move that to an automation agentic type of space and free up our people and our brains to be able to do more of that 10%?
100%. That is certainly the way that we will think about things. And I love the fact that we have a set of tools, and AI and the automation is only going to get better and better and better. And, knowledge is essentially now commoditized. And therefore, from a human point of view, that critical thinking, the creativity, the collaboration, the relationships, actually high judgment, that sort of taste level, I think that's where the difference will exist. And if we can automate things and we can create the time for the humans to do those bits, then let's do it and test that in that sort of 10%.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I'm of the same opinion. The AI can manage the knowledge and lead you with the decision making with the right people in there. So, Ellie, I really do appreciate you taking the time in this London morning. I want to get to the Sports Geek Closing 5. Do you remember the first sports event you ever attended?
Yes, it was the Le Mans 24-hour race, and
Wow.
it was in 1991.
That's one of the best answers, I think, so far. Do you have you've probably been to a lot of different sports events in your time. Do you have a favorite food at a sports event or a favorite food memory at a sports event?
I love eating, so far too many to remember. But I would say Japan is a country I really sort of love. So Japanese sports events and Japanese kind of traditions around food, drinks, the whole kind of mix, that would be where I'd go with that one.
It's on my list. My son just came back from there and all he did was rave about the food. So very, very much jealous of what he did. Running a global sport means all different time zones. What's the first app you open in the morning?
Oh, super boring. First app I will open in the morning. This is after I've checked what emails have come in after night, but it will be the train line to see whether the British transport system is running that day or not.
That's fair. That's absolutely fair enough because it does set your mood for the whole day, I'm assuming.
Absolutely.
And is there someone that you suggest the podcast listeners should follow? It might be a former colleague, it might be an author, it might be some random person on the internet that they should follow, and why?
Ooh, too many to name, but I'm a big podcast fan. So aside from the fact that your listeners will already be listening to you and Sports Geek, I love listening to the Uncensored CMO by John Evans.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll check that one out. I had not heard that one. But it is always good to hear other people, especially in, like, as much as I love talking to people in the world of sport, learning and from other industries and the problems they're having or the problems they're solving. So it's always a good get. And last question, and you can answer this personally, and then you can put your Formula E hat on. What social media platform is your MVP?
Ooh. So for me, I'm most probably, I'm 46, so I'm on that cusp of a millennial and Gen X. So I'm still in Instagram. Formula E, YouTube.
YouTube. It is still like, and the fact that it doesn't get bundled into the social media platforms, it's still, it's still the number 2 search engine. It's still where most people consume, if not more. And I think it's, largely been underrated by sports because all the rights have been locked up. So it seems to be unwinding and more sports are getting on there. So for any sport that's already on there, you've already got a leap ahead.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, Ellie, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I always ask listeners to reach out and say thank you. What is the best platform for them to do that if they were to do so?
LinkedIn.
LinkedIn it is. I will put a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes. Thank you very much. A Formula E race is on my list. Have not yet done it after speaking to Mark, so I've got to find a time to go to a race, and that would be amazing.
Well, please let me know and come as our guest.
I will do. And I hit stop.